Please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carolyn and Kathleen and everyone for coming out on this really beautiful day. I know the weather is gorgeous, so I appreciate you doing a Zoom and listening to my talk. So as it was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a journalist, and I typically write about real estate and New York for the Times. And I actually covered the story of the Plaza back in 2007 when it was converted into condominiums. And it sort of started my interest in the building. Although, you know, the Plaza is iconic. I mean, many of us have been there, have had tea in the Palm Court, have visited it, have memories of the hotel. You know, it really is kind of like the Brooklyn Bridge or the Empire State Building. But what I find special about the Plaza is that it is a hotel, and people have stayed there, people have lived there, and the characters really bring the building to life. So when I was starting to think about writing a book, and this is my first book, hopefully not my last, I thought the Plaza, you know, made a lot of sense because of all the stories and because of its iconic stature. I also had like a personal connection with the hotel. I grew up in New York City, and my grandmother, when she would come and stay, she lived in Pennsylvania, and she would come and stay, and she would sometimes stay at the Plaza. And it was very exciting to go there and have tea with her and visit the, you know, very fancy hotel. I also went to school not far from Central Park. So I would often go to Central Park after school, and, you know, the Plaza overshadows the skyline there. So I always knew the building and always had a lot of affection for it. And then about 10 years ago, I was very lucky, and I actually was married there. So I had sort of a personal connection and a professional connection. And, you know, even more than that, I felt like the Plaza really was kind of this perfect lens to tell a social history of New York, which was also really exciting. As I started to research the book, I spent about 3 years researching it, and I'm happy to talk about the process. But as I started to research it, I realized that it was like this amazing lens to see everything that had been happening in New York over the past 100+ years, and even in the country. So it was like this great vehicle to tell this larger story about the history of New York and the history of you know, America in some ways. So what I thought I would do today is just take you through some of the photos that are actually in my book, and give you a bit of a slideshow, and you can see why I love the hotel so much, and I'd love to, you know, hear your thoughts when it's over. So I will just share my screen now. Hopefully everyone can see this. So so before the Plaza ever existed, you know, on the corner of 59th Street and 5th Avenue, it was actually a skating pond. And when frozen over in the winter months, this skating pond was really a favorite playground for New York social elite. They would come here, they would get dressed up. There's wonderful old photos of them skating on this pond. And this is actually an image of a season pass for entry into this very exclusive, it was called the Fifth Avenue Skating Pond, and it dates from about 1863. So before the Plaza that we all know and love was there was actually an original Plaza. It was not the first Plaza Hotel. This is an image of the first Plaza Hotel. This was taken in about 1894. For a time, it was actually one of New York's grandest hotels. It stood about 8 stories and had about 400 rooms. And as was the norm back then, none of the rooms had their own bathrooms. You had to use one down the hall. At first, really this original Plaza drew a who's who of New York's elite, like General W.T. Sherman stayed there. There were many big parties, but really only after about 10 years, the hotel became overshadowed by a much bigger hotel, a much more glamorous hotel, which was the Waldorf Astoria, which many of you are probably familiar with. And only about a dozen years after this first original Plaza opened, it was sold to 2 partners who actually immediately tore it down. So here we have construction workers. This was taken about 1905, who are removing the foundation of this original Plaza Hotel. Critics were really shocked that the new owners, they paid the equivalent of about $90 million just simply to tear the hotel down. But a major reason was this original plaza lacked a steel skeleton, which is actually really critical. Before these steel skeletons were invented, buildings needed very thick curtain walls on the lower floors in order to handle the weight of the building rising above. But this limited buildings' height because these curtain walls could only be so thick. When they invented the steel skeleton, it allowed for the erection of essentially of skyscrapers because it was a solution to handle the weight and to distribute it along the length of the building. So the new plaza they built did have this steel skeleton. Okay, this is Harry St. Francis Black. There's a version of him as a young man. And then there's a picture of him a bit later when he's probably in his 60s. Harry was a really fascinating character. Not only did he build the plaza, he also built the Flatiron Building in New York and Macy's Herald Square and several other notable structures. He actually began his foray into real estate when he met and married the daughter of George Fuller. Interestingly, George Fuller was the architect who invented that steel skeleton that I just mentioned was so critical for the building of skyscrapers. So when George died, Harry actually took over his father-in-law's construction company, and from that base, he bought more buildings and more real estate firms, and he eventually created what was the first ever real estate, he became essentially the first ever real estate magnate. He was a very large and well-known landlord at the time. He was very handsome, as you can probably tell from these photos. And he eventually divorced George Fuller's wife, and he became a real man about town. He lived quite lavishly. He owned a penthouse on the top of the Plaza Hotel. He had his own Pullman railway car, and he went to all sorts of big parties. He was a really fantastic character. He was also a really big believer in stocks, especially during the 1920s Jazz Age. In fact, he became such a famous Wall Street booster that he even tried to sell stocks in order to fund his real estate buildings, which had never been done before. It was very unusual. But as you can imagine, the crash of 1929 was not kind to Harry at all. He actually became financially ruined, and he tried to drown himself in the bathtub of his Plaza penthouse. His valet did revive him, so he survived, but in 1930, unfortunately, Harry did die of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head. So it was quite dramatic. This is a picture here. The gentleman is Henry Janeway Hardenberg. He's actually the architect of the plaza. And the other image is from the Plaza Hotel taken in 1920. And hopefully you can see it really was super visible when it was first constructed. So Hardenberg is interesting. He also designed the Dakota apartment building in Manhattan, and he also designed the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel, not the one that currently we know, which is where it was. The original Waldorf is where the Empire State Building now is located. It was unusual even back in this era to have a site that was just so visible from multiple facades. So Hardenberg, he really took advantage of the plaza's visibility, and he constructed what was essentially a classical column. The first 3 stories of the plaza are finished in a rusticated marble, and they form the column's base, while the column shaft is made out of a terracotta brick. And of course, the famous mansard roof is green. It's made out of copper, and it's meant to reflect the green of Central Park across the street. Hardenberg himself was also very fascinating because actually just so little is known about him. Even though he was really quite famous during his lifetime and built many numerous buildings, well-known buildings, he gave only a handful of interviews. We do know that he came from a well-known aristocratic family, a Dutch family, and they helped found Rutgers University in New Jersey, but we're not even sure if he was married or if he had any children. This is an image of Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt. He was the Plaza's first ever guest. He was a dashing New York millionaire, and here he is with his first wife, Elsie French. Vanderbilt's mother actually lived next door to the Plaza in the Vanderbilt mansion, which is actually where the Bergdorf Goodman department store now stands. And only about 6 months after Vanderbilt moved into the Plaza, he actually divorced Elsie French, who's pictured here, after he met a woman horseback riding on the bridle path in Central Park. It caused all sorts of scandals, not least amongst his mother and his mother's friends, who were very aghast at this affair. But Vanderbilt eventually became a hero when a few years later he was on the Lusitania. The luxury ship was actually hit by a German torpedo during World War I, and Vanderbilt is credited with running around the deck of the ship and trying to save all the children and collecting them into lifeboats, and he even gave his own life jacket to a woman, although he did not know how to swim. So unfortunately, he too, his body was never found, and he did die on the Lusitania. It's very grim, some of these stories. Okay, this is a photo of the Plaza's Fifth Avenue facade on its opening day in 1907. As you can see, the Fifth Avenue entrance that we all know and we're familiar with didn't yet exist. That actually wouldn't be built until about 1923. But I like this photo for another reason. These are actually the first ever New York City taxi cabs, which were introduced to New Yorkers on the Plaza's opening day. It was sort of a marketing ploy. They were hoping that they would get the wealthy clientele of the Plaza to use the taxis, and they offered them for free to the guests. But as we know, taxis soon replaced horse-drawn hansom cabs as New Yorkers' favorite mode of transportation. I always find it a little ironic that today, of course, the only place we can find those horse-drawn hansom cabs are directly across from the Plaza, where their death knell was first introduced. So this is a picture of the Plaza lobby in 1907. It's kind of hard to see from here, but the hotel was incredibly sumptuously decorated. Decorators made buying trips to Europe. They spent about $3 million in Belfast, for instance, on Irish linen for the beds. They bought all the glassware from the Baccarat store in Paris. You may also be able to see on the left-hand side of the photo, those are the Plaza elevators. They were called plungers, and they featured these glass doors through which you could see the mechanical pistons going up and down. And they were quite famous, and they actually remained in use well into the 1970s. Okay, let's see. I guess this actually, okay. Here are some photos of the Plaza Widows. These are the elderly residents who lived at the Plaza for decades. They were famous for stationing themselves in the hotel lobby, where they would often remain for hours on end. They became sort of a meme of sorts. They were actually dubbed the 39 Widows of the Plaza, although I could never quite figure out where the phrase came from, since there were about 200 of them. The widows were actually not a new phenomenon at the hotel. From the moment it opened, the hotel actually was essentially an apartment building. A lot of people who checked in, including Vanderbilt, lived at the hotel full time. And back then, the idea of a hotel and an apartment was actually somewhat interchangeable. One of the first of the 39 widows is up in the corner. There's a photo of her holding a dog. Her name was Princess Parlagi. She was a Russian princess, supposedly, although some of her pedigree is a little questionable. She was actually quite a famous portrait painter, and she arrived at the Plaza in 1909 and brought with her essentially a menagerie of animals. There was an ibis, alligators, supposedly an owl. And during her stay at the Plaza, she went to the Ringling Brothers Circus, where she fell in love with a baby lion. She actually purchased the lion and kept it in the bathtub of her hotel suite at the Plaza for several months, until the management finally insisted that she get rid of the lion, and she gave it to the Bronx Zoo. And interestingly, the lion is buried in a pet cemetery in Westchester, not too far from you. You can go and see it, still there. Some of the other widows are Clarabelle Walsh, who is not pictured here, unfortunately, but she is a fantastic character in my book. She is actually credited with inventing the cocktail party, and she was a really big a friend of Broadway. She was really good friends with Ed Sullivan and many other Broadway stars, and held lots of parties at the Plaza during her time. You may also notice there's a man here with a cowboy hat in the corner. That's actually Conrad Hilton. So after Harry Black died, his company continued to own the Plaza for some time, but then Hilton purchased it in 1947. Hilton was actually just starting to make a name for himself as a hotelier, and this was his first really big New York purchase. The Plaza Widows, including Clarabelle Walsh, were very aghast that Hilton was buying the Plaza. They felt that he was a uncouth Westerner, a Texan, and he certainly would not understand sort of the blue blood ethos of the Plaza. Hilton was married at the time to Zsa Zsa Gabor, the famous movie star, and he did try to modernize the hotel. He put in air conditioning into the Plaza, he installed televisions, and he really updated the hotel. And eventually, there was a bit of a détente between him and the widows. They sort of made peace. Okay, let's see. So, this is photos of Kay Thompson. In the 1950s, she became essentially the most famous thing about the Plaza Hotel. Kay originally wanted to be a movie star, and she went to Hollywood, but she only really had one starring role as the Diana Vreeland character in Funny Face. Ooh. Sorry, my computer just fell. Some of you may have seen Funny Face. So she was in that movie, but essentially she mostly worked as a vocal coach for stars like Lena Horne and Judy Garland, who actually became one of her best friends. And she became the godmother to Liza Minnelli, Judy Garland's daughter. So eventually, Kay Thompson grew sick of trying to make it in Hollywood, and instead she decided to create a cabaret act. So here she is performing at the Plaza, and you may recognize some of the people behind her. These were the Williams brothers, including Andy Williams, who was her boyfriend for a while. She was quite successful, in no small part because Kay wore pants, and in the 1950s, pants on women was very unusual. She even manufactured them under the name Kay Thompson's Fancy Pants for Saks Fifth Avenue. And she had this big act, but it was really in book publishing that Kay became famous. In 1955, after performing at the Plaza one night, she met a young illustrator, Hilary Knight, and the two of them collaborated and eventually published the first Eloise book, which many of you may know is about a precocious 6-year-old who lives at the Plaza and has all sorts of misadventures, like pouring water down the mail chute. The Plaza was so excited about the popularity of these Eloise books. All these young fans started coming to the hotel, calling and asking to speak with Eloise. They really took advantage of this. They created an Eloise suite and had all sorts of Eloise marketing. And they let Kay live at the hotel for free, off and on for decades, which she did, until about the 1970s, when both the city and the Plaza was having a lot of financial difficulties, and Kay was living there for free, and they actually evicted her, and they gave her only about 24 hours to leave the premises. So it was very harsh. Okay. In 1964, the Beatles came to stay at the Plaza for their first New York visit. Some of you may remember this or recall it. Suddenly, the hotel staff was, it was very staid and boring and strict, and all of a sudden they were inundated by all these crazy teeny boppers, which you can see in this image here, chasing down the Beatles who were arriving by taxi to the Plaza. It was very interesting. I found out in my research that back when the Beatles made their reservation for the Plaza, they were not yet household names. And the hotel had no idea who they were. They merely just thought that 4 British businessmen were checking into the hotel. It was only about 2 weeks before the Beatles were set to arrive that someone asked the manager if he knew that the Beatles were coming. Immediately, the manager decided that he simply had to cancel the reservation. The Beatles image just did not match the rarefied atmosphere of the hotel. So he came home that night, and around his family's dinner table, he told them about his day, and he mentioned canceling this reservation. However, the manager had a 12-year-old daughter. Here she is in the other image. Her name was Lourdes, and she was inconsolable that her father was going to cancel on the Beatles. She became so hysterical, in fact, that in the end, he relented, and like any good dad, he let the Beatles come and stay, and the rest is history. I like this photo, which I include in my book, because obviously here's, with Lourdes is Ringo, Paul, and George. John was not there. He was supposedly downstairs mingling among the crowds, trying to remain incognito in a ski mask, although I can't imagine how well that went over. But I like it because there's also a little boy there in the photo. His name was Greg. He was Lourdes' little brother. You may notice that his hand is sort of hovering over his crotch area, and that's because moments before the photo was taken, Paul McCartney had stopped the photographer to point out that poor little Greg's fly was unzipped. So just a funny little anecdote there. Okay. Shortly after the Beatles came to the Plaza, Truman Capote held his famous party of the century, the Black and White Ball. It was heralded as the most coveted guest list in the history of parties. And here you can see Capote, who was not much taller than me, stood about 5 feet tall, with his date, Katharine Graham, who was the newly installed publisher of the Washington Post at the time. But just a few years after the Beatles and Truman Capote's Black and White Ball, by 1969, the innocence and the glamour of that era started to wane and were really replaced with a lot of unrest. Topics like the Vietnam War, civil rights, and women's equality started dominating the headlines. The Plaza became a target of its ear. The old-fashioned Oak Room was actually one of only 2 restaurants in New York City that did not allow women. And so many feminists decided to target the Oak Room. And you can see here, they were picketing in front of the hotel, including Betty Friedan and several other important women from the movement. Shortly after this photo was taken, actually, the women decided to go into the Oak Room and try to get served. Instead, the waiters came and simply took their table away. leaving the group of women sitting around an empty space. Some of the male diners felt quite bad for them and supposedly gave them some breadsticks, but eventually the women did walk out feeling quite defeated. However, a few months after this whole incident took place, the Oak Room did announce it was opening to women, so it did have the desired effect. Following the 1960s and the unrest of the late 60s, the 70s were just as difficult for the city. As I mentioned earlier, Kay Thompson was evicted, the plaza was having a lot of financial difficulties, and the city itself was on the brink of bankruptcy. This image over here with the garbage is basically one of the many sanitation strikes that hit the city. You can see what happened was the basement was filled with trash. No one was picking it up, so the hotel was forced to start piling it on the sidewalk. And the other image is from the famous blackout in the 1970s. Here are diners at the Palm Court. They're forced to dine by candlelight since there was no electricity. So, okay, I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit to the 1980s. Finally, the 80s arrived. Of course, this decade brought shoulder pads, hairspray, and of course, Donald Trump, which you can see he's sitting here in his office on the 26th floor of Trump Tower. And as you can see in the image, it had a direct view of the plaza. That's the building right behind him in the window. Trump always loved the hotel. He would often look out at it while he was considering his next big deal. He called it a masterpiece and the Mona Lisa. And so at the peak of the go-go 80s, Trump paid a historic amount for the hotel, about $500,000 per hotel room. But as soon as he bought the hotel, he installed his wife, Ivana, who's the other picture there, as the hotel's president. During the press conference announcing her hire, he famously quipped that he would pay her $1 and all the dresses she would want to buy. By all accounts, Ivana did an excellent job managing the plaza. She was incredibly detail-oriented, and she really did make it quite successful under her tenure. And to this day, she is the only female president of the plaza in its history. But while Ivana did help improve the financial standing of the hotel, when Trump purchased the property, he borrowed quite a bit of money from the banks in order to pay the purchase price, and he added additional debt on the plaza during his ownership in order to help fund some of his other real estate projects. So no matter how much the plaza was making, in the end, it wasn't earning enough to pay down its debt service. And a few years after Trump purchased the plaza, he became the only owner in its history to actually bankrupt it. So, okay. Eventually, Trump's creditors took over the plaza and they sold it to a Saudi prince, Al-Walid bin Talal, who's there, a photo of him, as well as a partner, a billionaire from Singapore. It was actually the beginning of foreign ownership, which is a fact that remains true to today. The plaza is still under foreign ownership. In this slide, you can see Al-Walid. He's standing at ground zero on October 11, 2001, which is the 1-month anniversary of the World Trade Center attacks. As an owner of the plaza, Al-Walid wanted to show his support for the city, so he flew from Riyadh to the World Trade Center, and he is seen here handing Mayor Giuliani a check for $10 million to help with the rebuilding efforts. However, just a few hours out after the photo was taken, the Saudi prince actually issued a press release where he criticized some American foreign policy, and it created a lot of backlash. Giuliani quickly returned the money. The next day's New York Daily News headline read, "Mayor Giuliani told a Saudi prince to take his 10 million and stuff it." So you can imagine what the atmosphere was like at the time. By 2004, however, New York City had largely recovered from 9/11 in terms of the real estate market. It was experiencing this huge condominium boom, and everyone was buying up hotels and buildings and converting them into very expensive apartments. This included an Israeli condominium developer, Mickey Naftali, he's pictured there all the way on the right with the glasses. He's holding a check here for the amount he eventually paid for the plaza. Mickey bet his whole reputation on purchasing the hotel. He'd actually tried to buy another hotel on Central Park to turn into condos, but he lost out on it. That building eventually became 15 Central Park West, which is one of the most expensive buildings in Manhattan still. Instead, he decided to set his sights on the plaza. But considering he was Israeli, he decided not to try to talk to the Saudi prince to purchase the building. Instead, he spent weeks trying to track down the sort of elusive Singaporean billionaire who was his partner, Kwek Leng Beng, who's also pictured here in the picture. Finally, he received a fax, as this was a long time ago, notifying him that Kwek Leng Beng would meet him in his office in Singapore the following day. So Mickey raced to book a flight. He had marathon negotiations with Kwek Leng Beng, and over about a dozen hours, he finally clinched this deal. Oh, sorry. There's some slides that are missing. Well, I'll just go on. So here we go. I'll go back to me. So shortly after Mickey bought the plaza, he basically got a lot of blowback since the plaza was one of the largest union employers in the city, and there had been this big condominium boom, and a lot of hotels had been converted into condos, and a lot of these hotel workers were losing their jobs, and they decided to make a real stand with the plaza. They spent about $2 million on a huge effort to save the plaza, and they held rallies where actresses like Sarah Jessica Parker performed and spoke, and Jesse Jackson, and it was a big to-do, and eventually they negotiated a deal where the majority of the plaza would be converted into condominiums for very wealthy owners, but a boutique hotel would remain, and there would also be a lot of retail spaces, which is currently what we have at the plaza. In 2012, Mickey had basically sold out all the condominiums, and he'd made about $1 billion in profit. So he decided he wanted to sell the hotel portion. So the boutique hotel that remained. So the buyer was actually this guy, Subrata Roy, who I went and visited in India as part of my research. And he bought the plaza. He was sort of this very colorful Indian tycoon. He owned his own cricket team. He lived in this massive estate in India. His house actually was modeled after the White House. It was about 300 acres, his property. He had his own Formula One racing team. He had all sorts of stuff. But about 2 weeks after he purchased the plaza, his empire came crumbling down when the Supreme Court essentially accused him of stealing about $3 billion from very poor Indians in what was essentially a Ponzi scheme. So this next photo I have of him is actually, I will go back, is actually him arriving at the Supreme Court in New Delhi trying to fight the case, and a critic threw a bottle of black ink at him and stained him. And he was arrested. He spent about 2 years in prison, and he actually ran the Plaza Hotel from his jail cell. When I was writing the book, he was out basically in home arrest and was not allowed to leave India, but was no longer in prison. And then about a year and a half ago, Subrata Roy essentially lost the hotel. All the money that he had and that the plaza was making was going back to to refund all these victims of his. And essentially, it's a sort of a convoluted deal, but the country of Qatar took over the Plaza Hotel. And they continue to own the Plaza today. They own the hotel, the boutique hotel, and the Palm Court, and all the shared spaces, everything except for the condominiums. And my hope was, you know, the Plaza, if anyone has been there in recent years, it's not exactly up to the standards that it once was, you know, in the 1950s when Eloise lived there. It's gone through several difficulties. Many of its rooms actually remain shuttered to the public, like the Oak Room and the Edwardian Room. And so I'm hopeful that maybe the Qataris, who obviously have a great amount of wealth, will reopen these spaces and really renovate the hotel and bring it back to its former glory. So this is actually a picture, I'll just close out, of its 100th birthday in 2007, right before it reopened as apartments. It was a huge party, and I just love this picture. I think it's so beautiful. And you know, as I say in my book, the Plaza was built in an era before radio, and it exists in the time of Facebook. Like a white marble mountain rising in the center of the city, it stands weathered, permanent, and implacable. It's been there for over 110 years. I really hope that, you know, we will see it there for another 100 years. Who knows? So that's a little bit of what I was going to talk about. And I'm happy to take questions or talk about certain aspects that you're interested in. So let me know. Oh, I see a question in the chat, so I can go to that. Oh, why does it not sell my book? Okay, so my book was not a authorized biography. The Plaza was has had a lot of, you know, publicity challenges in recent years, and it was quite concerned with what kind of book I was going to write. You know, it did not pay me to write the book. It did not have any oversight of the book. So while I did talk to dozens of people who were formerly worked at the Plaza or currently worked at the Plaza, you know, most of them talked to me off the record and not in public. And you know, the Plaza has been somewhat supportive of the book since it came out. I do think it really shows what a wonderful hotel it is and how special it is and how it means so much to New York and New Yorkers and Americans. But they haven't been quite as supportive as I would hope. So yes, the book is not available in its boutique, unfortunately. On the plus side, I was very lucky that the Today Show did a whole episode on the book, and they did allow Jenna Bush Hager and me to come and do a tour of several parts of the Plaza, and they did participate in that. But other than that one instance, officially the Plaza has not been super cooperative. So that answers your question. Does anyone else have anything they want to ask, or? I didn't talk as much about the history. I'm happy to, you know, talk more about that. I know some people often ask me about Trader Vic's or the Persian Room, which was a famous club. You know, there's so many great moments in history. So, or if anyone wants to share any memories they have, or not, it's fine. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I don't know if Carolyn or Kathleen, you want to say anything else, or?
I know we wanted to
Well,
say. Well, go ahead, Carolyn.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say the same thing. Thank you. This was fascinating. I think that I was once at the Plaza for something for my husband's law firm, and it was an amazing thing. And otherwise just standing across the street and sort of gazing at it. But this is very well. Tell us about this other room, the Persian room, or
Oh yeah,
you
so
started to say.
I mean, it's interesting. So now, you know, if you go to the Plaza now, it's very different than what it once was. But and I can talk about the condominiums and some of the amazing characters who live at the hotel now. Um, uh, some of the people who own apartments there and stuff. But yes, the Persian Room was in the 1950s and the 1940s. It was a really famous club. What happened was in the 1930s, actually, the Plaza had a lot of difficulties because it was the Great Depression and Prohibition. And obviously, they couldn't sell alcohol, and that's a huge money earner for hotels. Plus, it was the Great Depression, so people didn't have a lot of money. So they closed several rooms in the hotel, like the Oak Room. They removed the bar in the Oak Room and they converted it into a brokerage office for E.F. Hutton, for example. But after Prohibition was repealed, they decided they would celebrate by reopening the space. And they actually created an area of the hotel, which is where the lobby now stands on the corner of 58th Street and 5th. And they made it this really glamorous club called the Persian Room. And lots of famous acts were there, including Kate Thompson, who's the woman who eventually wrote the Eloise books. That's where she would often perform with Andy Williams. So, and a lot of other famous stars perform there.
Thank you. It looks like you have another question. Can you still do tea at the Plaza?
Oh yeah. So, I mean, right now with everything going on, the Plaza is closed. So like many hotels, it closed from from COVID, and so it has not yet reopened. But in normal times, yes, you can still go to the Palm Court and have tea. And the only other restaurant available is there's in the basement, there's a food hall, which is actually quite fantastic. There's a lot of great food there. You can get everything from like sushi to, I don't know, frozen yogurt. But because of the way that Mickey Naftali kind of divided up the hotel, it's very hard for the hotel to make any money. And one of the ways is downstairs in the basement, this food court. They actually rent all these small kiosks out, and they make money off the rent that they get from that. The Palm Court is a real money loser for the hotel, but they keep it open because obviously you need to have at least one restaurant there. It's interesting. I was there not long ago before all this happened, and I was talking to a waiter, Luigi, who's been there for about 50 years, and he was saying, you know, look around, Julie, at the dishes that people are eating, and you can see that none of them actually match. That the way it's run now, if they break a dish, they actually don't buy the same set. They're all sort of mismatched because they don't have the money even now under the Qataris to kind of buy the same matching set. So there's things like that that are still happening. But yeah, let's see. Yes, Kate Thompson was an amazing songwriter and singer. Absolutely. She was very amazing. Let's see. My father, who was a chef, worked at the Plaza. Oh, very cool. Yeah. There's who owns the penthouse too? Let's see. So now the penthouse that Harry Black once lived at, the whole building's sort of been divided. So the outside of the building is landmarked. It was landmarked in the 60s, and you can't change it at all. But inside, when they converted it about 10 years ago, they moved everything around inside to create these very large condominiums. So all the rooms that used to face Central Park are now apartments, not hotel rooms. So there's not the same penthouse that there used to be, and there was for many decades. It's now several penthouses. So it's a little hard to kind of compare apples to apples. But yeah, what is the Plaza's role in film? The Plaza has long been sort of a thumbnail or a symbol of wealth and celebrity for books and also movies. So obviously, famously, Cary Grant is kidnapped in North by Northwest at the Oak Room, and you have a great scene of him walking through the plaza. There's been, obviously the Plaza Suite, which is a play, but takes place at the plaza. F. Scott Fitzgerald, used the plaza many, many times, loved the plaza, never actually stayed there from what I could tell, but he used it as sort of a shorthand in several of his books. He had protagonists who lived at the hotel, in The Beautiful and the Damned, obviously very famously the Great Gatsby, the pivotal scene at the Great Gatsby took place at the plaza. So, it's helped feed kind of the idea that we all think of when we think of the plaza. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, if anyone else wants to ever talk to me, I'm always available on social media and my website. I love getting emails and questions. I'm also happy to sign any books if you end up buying them. As it was so nicely mentioned at the start, my book just came out in paperback, so it's more affordable than the hardcover, and it still has all the beautiful images, a few of which I went through, but there's more in the book. And yeah, I hope you guys liked it.
We loved it, Julie. Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much. I really appreciate it, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a
It
great
was
day.
wonderful. Thank
Bye.
you very much.